Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. As soon as Benjamin Netanyahu vacated the Prime Minister's office some 14 months ago, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan moved to unfreeze Turkey's relations with Israel. When Foreign Minister Yair Lapid failed to respond to Ankara's advance, Erdogan outflanked him and found a warm welcome in Jerusalem's non-executive presidency, eventually bringing around Lapid and the other alternate Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Now, another step up the ladder was marked, with Erdogan and Lapid announcing the return of their respective ambassadors after a dozen-year hiatus. Is it symbolic or substantial? And what's ahead for the Turkish-Israeli relationship? To analyze this topic, we're joined from Central Israel by retired Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the co-host of TV7 Middle East Review, a Powers in Play panelist, the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and Editor-in-Chief of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Lerman. Also joining us from another location in Central Israel is Dr. Eytan Cohen Yanarocak, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, as well as the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us as well. And I'd like also to welcome our TV7 editor-at-large and host of TV7 Watchmen Talk and Powers in Play, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us a broader understanding on the latest regarding the Israel-Turkey relationship.
So the most salient fact, which you mentioned, is that it was all Erdogan's initiative. He is, of course, has been in power for the last 20 years now. He was the one to decide on this chill in relations, starting some 14 years ago, and obviously after the May 2010 Mavi Marmara incident, freezing it even more, including the recall of the ambassadors. So now President Erdogan, for his own reasoning, because of his strategic reassessment, decided that the time is ripe for a rapprochement with Israel under new management. It is, of course, ironic that many in Israel, in the opposition to Netanyahu, accused him of acting in an Erdogan-like manner. But Erdogan apparently feels more comfortable with this opposition, which is now in power. Now, whether Israel can respond in kind, having changed its entire array of friends and partners in the Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, the Israeli relationship with Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, and other players in this game has changed markedly over these dozen years. So the very fact that ambassadors will be stationed again in Tel Aviv and Ankara may not mean a lot. We have to see what substance we will see in the relationship.
Indeed. Well, I'd like to refer the first question to you, Dr. Lerman, if I may, and go a little bit down memory lane, considering the fact that the relations between Turkey and Israel have been quite bad, as also Mr. Oren just alluded to, going all the way to the Mavi Marmara in 2010. Of course, subsequently, there were some attempts which were ultimately successful in light of the intervention of the then President of the United States, Barack Obama, regarding trying to seek a rapprochement, which ultimately brought about the famous, if you will, phone call in the presidential vehicle of President Obama in front of Air Force One at Ben Gurion International Airport, in which they had a phone conversation. Track 2 diplomacy behind the scenes was established, and Israel, of course, asked or voiced regret for the loss of life for those killed at Mavi Marmara, all the while paying compensation to the families of those Turkish activists. Nevertheless, we saw a short period of rapprochement, if I'm not mistaken, 2015 or 2016, where there was a sort of normalization of relations, not really a true one. But now again, this is seeming to have been forged not necessarily for the right reasons. We have Greece, we have Cyprus, a warming relations there, significant relations. And then also, on the other hand, we have Egypt, which is not always the best of friends with Ankara. What can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, a very quick reminder. There was a renewal of relations at ambassadorial level back in 2016. The apology came in 2013 during Obama's and the compensation package. And then it took 3 more years for Netanyahu to decide that Erdogan is a fact of life and we should normalize relations. And it was done in 2016. And 2 years later, Erdogan, basically reacting to events on the Gaza border that involved the serious loss of life on the Palestinian side, kicked out the Israeli ambassador, my friend Eytan Cohen, who is now ambassador in Bahrain, in a deliberately humiliating manner, and basically charted for a number of years, I would say for a couple of years until 2020, a course of very aggressive neo-Ottoman conduct in the Eastern Mediterranean, culminating in the intervention in Libya. Now, these things do not seem to be connected, but they are. Because Israel's position is first and foremost a function of our, as you said, of our relationship now with Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus, what I tend to call not an alliance, but an alignment of forces in the Eastern Mediterranean that was at loggerheads with the Turkish position, with the way the Turks drew the borders of the exclusive economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean, the EEZ. And all of this was very quickly linked up with the Abraham Accords, because particularly the United Arab Emirates came in support of the Egyptian-Greek position. Israel did the same, and this all happened within days of the actual cooking up of the Abraham Accords. Moreover, the UAE joined Israel, Cyprus, and Greece in the so-called Paphos Forum of Foreign Ministers in April 21. So we are looking at a sequence of events which indicates that this is not necessarily so much about the politics of Israel as it is about the broader regional, talking Eastern Mediterranean balance of power. Now, 2 things happened to Turkey, I believe, and of course I defer to Chai's understanding of the Turkish scene. But I believe that 2 major things happened that changed Erdogan's calculus. The first, the most obvious, the one that everyone refers to clearly, is the collapse of the Turkish economy, the down cycle of the Turkish lira, the 70-odd% inflation rate, the common assumption that you hear increasingly now, that this may cost him presidential elections next year. All of this drove him in the direction of those who could help him out, and that's the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And ironically, in today's world, which would be flabbergasting to people who looked at the region 10 years or 20 years ago, even 5 years ago, today, to be a friend of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, you also need to normalize your relations with Israel as well as with Egypt. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that in Libya, with the threat of an Egyptian military intervention, a kind of equilibrium was reached in which the Turks saved their client, the Egyptians protected their client, Haftar, and there was no prospect essentially of resolving this by force one way or the other. So Turkey had to climb down from its high moral horse in Libya and settle for some sort of contacts directly with Haftar and with Egypt and with the what I call the camp of stability in the region to basically stabilize the situation there. Between these two factors, you have the conditions for a campaign, an active campaign by Erdogan, courting the UAE, courting the Saudis, courting the Egyptians to some extent, and courting Israel. Left out are the Greeks, who are now the target of a very virulent Erdogan campaign, stirring up nationalist sentiments in the run-up to the election. He basically said, I understand that he has been saying that Mitsotakis for him no longer exists, etc. And there are tensions over the Greek military presence in Castellorizo, etc. Israel, I believe, will not abandon its relationship with Greece and Cyprus, which has been painstakingly built. We've just witnessed this year a massive deployment of Israeli forces to exercise in Cyprus, unprecedented in our entire history. And I think the benefits of this outweigh anything that we may gain from shifting sides in the Eastern Mediterranean. So
Indeed.
the ambassadorial step is a normal step between two nations that no longer seek each other's harm. But to think that this would lead to a renversement des alliances, the shift from the Hellenic perspective to a Turkish one, I doubt it very much.
Not to forget, of course, that immediately after the normalization of relations between Turkey and Israel, Greece also announced the procurement of the drone dome from Rafael Limited, the military or the defense industry here in Israel, with emphasis in its statement that it aims to protect Greece against Turkish drones with Israeli technologies, which is quite ironic that it happened immediately after the normalization. And of course, the Iron Dome sale by Israel, which is expected to occur to Cyprus, which also aims in its statement to protect Cyprus against Turkish aerial threats.
So it's the Irony Dome.
The Irony Dome, indeed. But I'd like to ask Dr. Eytan Cohen Yanarocak on your perspective, from an Israeli perspective, if you will. How do you see this move by Turkey, which obviously is not necessarily keen from a warm perspective or to establish warm relations with Israel, but rather it sees it as realpolitik. It needs Israel at this stage. It has the rivalry vis-a-vis the Russians in Syria, vis-a-vis the Russians also in the Black Sea, but also vis-a-vis the Iranians. There are more and more challenges taking place at this stage. Do you see this as the main equation, or is it indeed purely an economic and political one for domestic purposes?
Well, first of all, I have to emphasize here that the current reconciliation between Israel and Turkey is a very fragile one, and I'm very skeptical for that it is a genuine one, that it is conducted by the goodwill, but instead I really believe that it is basically implemented because of the deterioration of the Turkish economy combined with the Turkish diplomatic isolation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Dr. Lerman already mentioned, but let me also analyze this from my point of view. I think the most important U-turn for the Turkish foreign policy was, of course, the success of the Abraham Accords. At the beginning, the Turks were very skeptical, and they even openly told in their official statements that they are not approving the Abraham Accords at all costs. But then we began to see that they began to soften their stance vis-a-vis that. And the most important reason for that, of course, the Turkish administration believed that the Abraham Accords would collapse right after the departure of Donald Trump from the White House. But what happened was the exact opposite. Even if Donald Trump was departed from the White House, we began to see that also the current Biden administration began to strengthen the Abraham Accords, and later which paved the way for the Negev summit, which ushered the new Middle East. Let me remind for our audience that during the Negev summit, the Israeli Foreign Ministry hosted the American, Moroccan, Egyptian, Bahraini, Emirati foreign ministers. It was indeed a historic point of view. And as a result, the Turks understood then if they are not going to take a tangible move, then they will be out of this new equation in the Middle East. And in that regard, I would also like to underline the historic role of the President of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, who basically paid a visit to Turkey and ushered an investment of $10 billion. With that particular investment, the UAE basically bought the tendency of the Turkish foreign policy. And since then, we are seeing revolutionary U-turns in the Turkish foreign policy. Turkey began to conduct a rapprochement vis-a-vis Israel. Then, at the same time, we began to see the same type of maneuvers vis-a-vis Egypt. Then they normalized their relations with the Saudi Arabia. Nowadays, the unthinkable is happening. Mr. Erdogan is also underlining his readiness to normalize his relations with the Assad regime. And of course, since everything is very much dependent to everything, in my opinion, this is very much related to Turkey's bilateral relations with Russia. Recently, Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine reached on a deal for the wheat corridor from Black Sea to the Turkish port of Istanbul. The Ukrainians are sending the wheat via ships, and thanks to the Turkish mediation, Erdogan is seeking to lower the price of the wheat. And needless to say, that in Turkey, the cost of living is very high, the inflation is very high, the devaluation of the Turkish lira is deteriorating everywhere, every day. Today, the $1 is became equal to 18 liras. So he has to deliver an economic miracle. So in order to do that, he also has to please Vladimir Putin at the same time. So that is why he's doing this U-turn in Syria. Long story short, I believe that the current Turkish foreign policy is not stemmed from a genuine ideology shift, but rather the current diplomatic and economic circumstances are pushing Turkey to normalize her fences, not only with Israel, but also with the other states in the region.
Indeed.
There was another development which, of course, is related to the Abraham Accords. Historically, Israel looked west and especially wanted to have some association with NATO. And because of the Israeli quest for this partnership with NATO, Turkey had leverage over the Israeli relationship with Brussels in general.
So this is really what I wanted to ask you. What is Israel's angle in this? Is it the NATO relationship?
Now that Israel is looking east and they would rather have exercises with the Fifth Fleet out of Bahrain rather than the Sixth Fleet out of Naples, Turkey can no longer interfere in the relationship between Israel, the United States, which has its European command, EUCOM, dual-headed with NATO. Only a few years ago, when Israel wanted to take part in a common endeavor in one of the NATO operations in the Mediterranean, Turkey could have vetoed it, and actually did by putting many obstacles on the wet road to the operation. Now, neither Israel nor the United States need Turkish acquiescence. So this has removed a point of friction between Israel and Turkey behaves accordingly.
Indeed. Well, if I may, Dr. Lerman, I'd like to ask you the same question I just raised with Mr. Oren. What is Israel's angle? Obviously, Turkey is there. It's a powerful regional neighbor, not necessarily a neighbor, but it is a powerful actor in this region with the largest or second largest military in NATO. Relations are precarious at best with the West, which Israel is enjoying much warmer relations in that sphere. And it is within the context of dealing with a country that it knows firsthand that relations fluctuate. One day it's in one route and the other day it's in another. Is this something that, or is there something that we're missing here?
Well, as usual, the answer to many questions about Israeli policy nowadays is that four-letter word, Iran, which explains the interest of Israel of drawing as much as possible Erdogan away from his complex, sometimes tense, sometimes cooperative relationship with Iran, and closer towards what I called already the camp of stability, the Saudi interest, the Emirati interest, and the Israeli interest. So broadening the channels of dialogue with Turkey on this question could be important. We all have to bear in mind that the Turkish secret services fully cooperated with Israel in foiling a series of, I should say, professionally half-baked, dastardly attempts by hirelings of the Iranian regime to assassinate the former consul general in Istanbul, of Israel in Istanbul, and Israeli tourists in their hotels or whatever. The Turks acted in a very effective and straightforward manner. And I think this angle gave a certain reason in Israel to hope that Erdogan could be drawn away from Iran. And of course, that could be a crucial element in whatever scenario may evolve now, whether the JCPOA is renewed or not, whether we face a conflagration in Lebanon or not. It's better to basically also have a channel with Turkey under these circumstances. But the other assumption that you hear from time to time, that this is also about gas, that Israel is looking, once the Americans withdrew their support from the East Med pipeline, that Israel is now looking to Turkey for an alternative. That's a bit far-fetched, if I may say so, because quite frankly, to lay a pipeline from the Israeli gas fields to Turkey would have, by necessity, to go either through the Cypriot EEZ, and that's an impossibility as long as the Cyprus problem is unresolved, or through the Lebanese and Syrian EEZs, which is an even greater absurdity under any conditions, unless the impossible happens and we have peace all of a sudden. So there's no pipeline in the works, frankly. If the Turks are delusional about it, that Israel would actually agree to force a line through Cypriot waters, that's not going to happen.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like still to give Dr. Cohen Yanarocak a chance to provide us some perspective, because there is the Azerbaijani angle in this whole equation. Azerbaijan is a close partner of Israel, of course, an even closer ally of Turkey, and it has been working behind the scenes for quite some time to try and seek some sort of rapprochement between Turkey and Israel. Azerbaijan is obviously the northern neighbor of Iran, a rival of Iran. It was on the verge of war for several months between Iran and Azerbaijan, and Turkey, of course, did a joint maneuver with it to try and repel that Iranian aggression. Do you see this also as one of the equations that brought about the relationship to, once again, relatively normal levels between Ankara and Jerusalem?
I think this should also be taken into consideration when we are looking at the Caucasian arena. During the last Second Karabakh War, we happen to see that Azerbaijan enjoyed from Israeli military technology, despite the fact that Ankara and Jerusalem did not plan together to support Baku on this skirmish against the Armenians. But at the outcome, all of a sudden, also in Turkey, also in Azerbaijan, and also in Israel, people began to speak about this trio, the trilateral alliance that can contain Iran. I think this can be taken into consideration, and I think there is a window of opportunity to use Azerbaijan as a common denominator to strengthen the bilateral relations between Israel and Turkey. Of course, given the Azeri victory over Armenia, the Turkish public they really celebrated this victory, and also portraying Israel as a part of this victory would basically contribute to Israel's reputation inside Turkey. But I also believe that that should be also utilized for strategic reasons to contain Iran. We all know that the Iranians are trying to deter Azeris by conducting military drills next to the Azeri borders. So, in my opinion, Israel should do its best in order to strengthen Azerbaijan together with Turkey, and why not? We can turn this into a trilateral trio alliance.
Indeed. Well, unfortunately, we reached the end of today's production. The time ran out. There's still much to discuss on this specific matter. Nevertheless, I'd like to thank Dr. Leumann, Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's program. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well. And we will see you next time.